Shehan Jeyarajah. There we are. CBS Sports joins us on the show. Thanks for moving it back a little bit. We had Kalani Sitake and then Scott Drew, and you said, hey, I'll be ready at 4:25, and here we are with you. Thanks for your time. So there's some quotes in this article that I read. It's absolute bedlam. There was one on talking about the transfer portal. All the timelines are all mixed together. Here's another one. I'm indicting everyone, including myself, a longtime athletic director, on what we have. Can this be fixed? How can not smart people get in the room and get this fixed?
Well, there are some real complications with this, and one of them is the literal academic calendar, right? So, like, you can't move back the transfer portal, for example, because, like, you do physically need to get people enrolled in classes. And so I think that's going to be a major complication that heads forward. Now, I think the biggest thing is that you need to at least figure out some way that you can move these dates around. Like right now, we have conference championship games, college football playoff games, postseason games, bowl selection, coaches carousel, transfer portal, high school recruiting, all happening at the same time. It's almost impossible to truly deal with. I think that probably high school recruiting is the easiest one to deal with, where maybe you can either move that up or push it back to February like it was before. But a lot of this stuff is just going to be inevitable to a certain extent, as long as college sports are tied to collegiate classes.
Shehan, we were just talking about some of the transfer names that are out there right now. Jackson Arnold landing at Auburn. What were your thoughts? Seems to make a lot of sense. Smokey's a little less convinced that he's actually the guy based on what he's seen. But do you think this is a nice bounce back spot for Jackson Arnold?
Yeah, it's the thing that I don't love about it is that it's a lot of pressure to perform right away. And I don't know exactly how much of a good situation it is if you're Jackson Arnold. You're going to have a chance to come in and compete day one, which I think is a good thing. But we didn't necessarily see a whole lot of consistency from the rest of this offense. This offensive line hasn't been especially good. You'd think you'd at least have some wide receivers, but we'll see. Hugh Freeze also asked a lot of his quarterbacks, and that's a lot to step into in year one. And by the way, if Hugh Freeze doesn't win this year and win 6 or 7 or 8 games, he's probably fired. And you're starting all over again in 2026. So it's an interesting fit. I don't hate it, but I just think that there's going to be a lot of pressure put on Jackson Arnold. And if I were him, I'd want to find some place that really is invested in me growing long term.
Yeah, I think maybe the fact he was playing for an offense that fired their coordinator, Craig brought that up. I just thought he just looked not quite as good as I thought when I saw him coming out of high school. Of course, he's a young kid, so that can happen.
Well, and I think that you look, and first of all, I will say, I was not happy whatsoever with the way that Oklahoma treated him. One, I mean, look, he had growing pains at the beginning. I think that's fair to say. But I've never seen a program so publicly give up on a player of his pedigree before. He was the #1 player in the state of Texas, top 10 national recruits, and they basically kind of threw him to the wolves after he had like one bad game at Oklahoma. And then you look, and it turns out that this offense is just not very talented. The offensive line was really bad. They dealt with some major wide receiver injuries. Their running game never got going. It wasn't schemed very well, frankly. Like, there were so many things that were wrong at Oklahoma that had nothing to do with Jackson Arnold. And Oklahoma seemed perfectly content to kind of say, no, like, our quarterback just wasn't good enough. We're going to bench him, move in another direction. Well, it turns out going in another direction didn't help that much. So I still think he has a lot of talent. Again, though, I just feel like I wish that he had gone to a place that would be willing to invest long-term in him. I mean, the reality of, I could think you could almost make this case of like almost every major SEC school at this point is like, if you don't perform right away, they're going to kick you right out, just like Oklahoma did. I would have loved to see him end up in a place where maybe he has a little bit more time.
Speaking of Oklahoma, it seems like they've got their alternate plan. It's just a matter of if he pulls the trigger or not. And a lot of signs pointing towards John Mateer now in the portal, possibly landing at an Oklahoma. But Shehan, I think you know a good deal about him. Watched him this year. Very productive player, very exciting player. How much attention do you think he's getting? And do you think it's a kind of a foregone conclusion that Oklahoma and a reunion with Ben Arbuckle is the spot for him?
Well, it's definitely a heavy favorite. I think one complication is that Miami appears to have gotten into the mix. And if you know much about the former Washington State quarterback Cam Ward's recruitment process, they are no strangers to throwing some money around and some opportunity around. So I do think that he will end up at Oklahoma, but it is by no means a done deal at this point. He's a really good player. Like, I got to talk to Eric Morris, who recruited him to Washington State. At the time, he was actually committed to Central Arkansas. He had really no other major offers other than Washington State and New Mexico State. And obviously, he's developed into being a really good player there. He led the country with 44 touchdowns responsible for. He had 15 rushing touchdowns, which was the Washington State record. And that's what he brings to the table to a power conference team, is he's going to go in and be able to contribute both as a passer and as a runner as well. I think that Oklahoma probably needs somebody who can do both, especially since we don't really know what's going to happen with him at receiver. Now, at the same time, if you are John Mateer, I mean, you have your pick of the litter. You are the number one overall player in the transfer portal, according to 247 Sports. You can find yourself a little bit of a better situation. You know, I talked about it with Jackson Arnold and stepping into a lot of pressure. I don't think that Oklahoma is necessarily too much pressure for John Mateer, but I do think that there are programs that are out there with openings that will have better options at receiver, have better options at offensive coordinator. We just don't know necessarily what this Oklahoma team is going to look like in 2025.
Shehan, are there any in the first round, which starts, of course, Friday and it's Saturday, of these games, Clemson, Texas, Tennessee, Ohio State, SMU, Penn State, Indiana, Notre Dame, which of those two, is it Tennessee, Ohio State, that's the biggest, what I call banger of two named teams and even two good teams that are playing each other?
Well, look, you look at all four have betting lines of more than a touchdown. Mm-hmm. But I think that the games are going to be a little closer than what they may appear. And I will say, I don't know if that Ohio State-Tennessee game is going to be one of them, though. I think that's going to be an incredibly low-scoring game. Two of the top 5 defenses in college football, and two offenses that really struggled when they went up against some of the better defenses in college football. So I think that Ohio State's going to eventually pull away with that game. The two that are most interesting to me, I'd say, I've got a close eye on SMU versus Penn State. I mean, look, Penn State is as unproven as any team in the country right now. Probably their second best win, or maybe their best win, arguably, is playing Oregon kind of close, which is, you know, kind of what we said about Boise State as well. Well, SMU comes to town, and SMU has their own problems, certainly, but they've got an offense that does such a great job of taking advantage of opportunities behind quarterback Kevin Jennings. He's just one of those guys who extends plays. He turns 0-yard gains into 3-yard gains. And when you're going against a team like Penn State that really is very good defensively, I think that SMU has the ability to hang on to the ball and make things interesting. And on the other side, I don't think people realize how good SMU's passing defense is in 2024. They have one of the most fearsome pass rushers in the country, and I think it'll be an interesting matchup. The other one, too, just filled with storyline, especially for people in the state of Texas, Clemson versus Texas. A rematch, by the way, of the quarterbacks in the 2021 6A D1 state title game. Quinn Ewers was playing for South Lake Carroll, of course, and Cade Klubnik for Austin Westlake. I'll have a story on that later this week. Now, look, I mean, the reality is Texas is a much better team at this point than Clemson, but Clemson just has some playmakers on both sides of the ball. Barrett Carter at linebacker is one who comes to mind. Obviously, on offense, you talk about Klubnik, you talk about Bryant Wesco, the fantastic freshman receiver for them. And again, this is a team that ironically is the one who's been there and done that. Texas has not at this point. So I'll be fascinated to see how Dabo Swinney prepares for this one.
Were you hoping to see SMU in Texas? I was really hoping to see that, as opposed, I mean, Clemson, Texas is going to be awesome, but I mean, come on, man. Like, they just flip them the spot, and we just saw the game the day before. I couldn't believe we didn't get that draw.
Yeah, I know. It would have been a lot of fun to have a chance to get that game. You know, SMU has been waiting just for a stage and for a moment, especially when you compare them to other teams in the state of Texas, right? Like, I mean, they want the TCUs, the Baylors, the Texas A&Ms, and the Texases, of course. It would have been a lot of fun to get to see that matchup, but I will say I do feel like SMU matches up a little better with Penn State than they would have versus Texas.
Certainly, yeah. Shehan, elsewhere, I mean, you ran down all the different crazy stuff that's going on. The carousel's kind of slowed to a crawl. It's mostly position coaches and things like that sort of filling in the blanks now, but What did you make of just the big reunion of Rich Rodriguez and the West Virginia faithful, the big to-do at the end of last week with his introduction, and McAfee's there, and it just seems like there's definitely an electricity there. Whether it works out or not is the big question, but having seen it all kind of unfold, what do you make of maybe a renaissance in Morgantown, West Virginia?
Well, I'll say this. I think that if you wonder why Neil Brown got fired, the answer is that West Virginia has not been relevant his entire tenure. They won 9 games last year, but they didn't really beat anybody of note. They've actually lost 10 straight games against AP-ranked opponents. They're one of only 3 programs in the power conferences to not appear in the rankings in the AP Top 25 since 2019. And the reality is, that's why he was fired. They want to be more relevant. And what could be more relevant than appearing on ESPN, on Pat McAfee's show, on being this giant reunion that everybody's talking about? And look, we don't know at this point whether Rich Rodriguez is going to be able to drag West Virginia back to the success that he had in the late 2000s. But this is a coach, by the way, when you talk about reunions, who this past year won Conference USA at Jacksonville State. He was very successful during his time at Arizona. Really, the only failure he has on his resume is at Michigan. And I think that was obviously just a little bit of a weird cultural fit in a lot of ways. So I don't know if Rich Rodriguez is prepared to kind of deal with the new world at West Virginia, but I can tell you this for certain. This program and this fan base has not been more united, excited, engaged in a very long time. And I think that for a program like West Virginia right now, that just has to be the first step.
Yeah, when we brought up that Neil Brown was most likely gone, and then of course he was, and then the search, we didn't know because we're not. It doesn't have to be you're from Morgantown, but there are certain places where you kind of need to be. And we have a lot of people in the chat, a lot of West Virginia fans. And initially it looked like it was not 100%. It was like maybe either way. And then it steamrolled. It absolutely steamrolled. And it does appear, as you said, that they're as united as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting too, right? Both programs in the state of West Virginia ultimately changed head coaches, with Charles Huff going to Southern Miss from Marshall. And they kind of did a similar thing. They hired Tony Gibson, a West Virginian by birth, to be their head coach as well, the former defensive coordinator at NC State. So I think that there's something to be said at an estate like West Virginia, at a program like West Virginia, for people who really want to be there and really understand what it means and who really want to engage with the environment. I mean, obviously, our good friend Joey McGuire at Texas Tech, I think, has brought that in a big way as well. And you see the level of investment that can come with it. You can just sell a place better when you do truly want to be there. And so I think that for West Virginia, that's going to be a huge dynamic with Rich Rodriguez coming in. And the other thing, too, it's like, I mean, they haven't gotten to play a whole lot of fun football since Dana Holgorsen left in 2018. They haven't had these great performances. They haven't had these breakout stars on the offensive side of the ball. I think more than anything else, like if you're a West Virginia fan, the hope is that this is at least a little bit more fun.
Yeah, I think so. Last thing, and we appreciate your time, Shehan, is that we had Kalani Sitake on, and one of the things he talked about is that you cannot think you know the Big 12. Like, they were an example this year. Colorado was an example this year. No one better than Arizona State and their example. And the history of teams rising from being poo-pooed like at the start of the year with rankings, whatever. What does make the Big 12 special, in your opinion, even though they may not have the name brands and the logos and the blue bloods?
Well, I think that when you look at the Big 12, this is a 16-team conference where all 16 teams are fully engaged. And you look across the rest of college football, I mean, I think that there are some programs who have resigned themselves to not being relevant, right? Like you look at, in the ACC yesterday, right? Wake Forest, their coach Dave Clawson steps down. They haven't seemed very committed long-term to long-term success on the football field. In the Big Ten, right? You have the Purdues, you have the Rutgers that just have no chance of contending at a high level. Well, I think that in this moment in the Big 12, everybody's like, well, you might as well try. I think that all 16 teams in the conference are there right now. I mean, you look at the teams that were picked to last place in the conference. Arizona State, of course, goes and wins the Big 12. You look at BYU, like you mentioned, picked 13th in the Big 12. Houston ended up winning 2 or 3 games. Like, there is not a team right now that isn't trying to figure it out. And one thing that I've loved about the Big 12 outside of Texas and Oklahoma for 25 years, essentially, is that this is a conference of strivers. It's a conference of people who really are willing to do what it takes to try and compete and contend and innovate. I think to the development of the air raid happening in the Big 12 in the 2000s. I think of the rise of the 3-3-5 defense under Matt Campbell in Iowa State. Like, I think that you always are going to have programs trying to stay ahead of the curve because everybody wants to win and everybody wants to figure out what's next. And that's not something that you get everywhere in college football.
Yeah, and they're scratching and clawing to do it, and it's kind of fun when they do. You're a Baylor grad, right?
Yes.
All right. Have you seen the new helmet?
I have.
All right, here, Garrett, you have a picture of it, right? It's a scripted Baylor written across the side, and I saw the reaction in a thread on Sikkim365.com, and it seemed to me that the reaction, because Baylor fans can be very fickle about everything, that the reaction was very positive. What was it from your end?
Yeah, I mean, I got texts from people who are fans of like other programs than the Big 12 who are like, oh, those are really cool. Those are really cool helmets. I will say, I'm not the craziest about the gold, just like in general with helmets and jerseys, but I do think the design of these are really cool. Script is something that's really hard to mess up. I love when they did it on the basketball court. And by the way, their reveal video with Langston Love handing it over to Sawyer Robertson, that was a lot of fun. So I think they did a really good job, and I'm excited to see what they look like on the field.
Shehan, we're off all of next week to get a little bit of decompression. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year to you, young man. We appreciate it.
Merry Christmas to y'all.
All right, that's Shehan Jeyarajah from CBS Sports.